Mom's inheritance. That house, right? How do we divide it? Huh. When Mom fell ill, I checked the whole house, but there didn't seem to be anything valuable in it. Are you thinking of continuing to live there? If that is the case, I won't get anything from it. Wait a moment. You can't just spring this on me all of a sudden. We've had 6 months to think about it, so it's not all of a sudden, is it? And then, here's what I've thought. The house is old, and I think it's becoming unsafe to live in soon. Even if we renovate the house, it will cost so much money because it's a big rural house. So why not demolish the house and sell the land instead? The land is spacious, so I think it will fetch a decent amount of money, and it will be easier to divide once we have cash on hand. My mother had just passed away, and not even 2 seconds had passed since we left the hospital room. My sister had started talking about the inheritance distribution as if it were the most natural thing to do. It was inappropriate to have that sort of conversation yet. People have many different emotions, but at that moment, anger surpassed them all. My sister's words triggered a wave of anger on top of my sadness. Are you fine with me taking everything that's left in the house? You're single, so you don't really need that much money, right? But that would be too unfair. How about this? You can have the rundown shed in the garden. You can have whatever is in there. We'll split the land between the two of us, so let's share the cost of demolishing the house equally. But I am giving you the shed, so you'll have to cover the cost of its demolition on your own. I had so much to say about my sister, but right now, my priority was my mother. Fine, I agree. Really? Ah, yay. Thank you. As soon as I accepted my sister's demands, she didn't even try to return to the room where our mother was. Instead, she left the hospital with a spring in her step. It seemed like our mother was nothing more than a piggy bank to her. My anger continued to grow inside me. However, when my sister was gone, I surprised myself by immediately agreeing to demolish our childhood home and sell the land. Later on, I realized that my quick decision was a way for our parents to push me to be responsible for my sister in their absence. The realization came when I was clearing out the rundown shed that my sister had pushed onto me, and I discovered a hidden safe that I had never seen before. My name is Holly. I'm 48 years old and work as a caregiver. As I've gotten older, I've noticed that more and more people around me are finishing raising their children and spending quality time with their partners. I'm not one of those people, though. I am still single and have been living in my rural childhood home. 5 years ago, my father passed away from an illness, so now it's just my mother, Anna, and me living together. Despite being almost 50, I have no experience with raising children or enjoying the company of a partner. People sometimes give me a pitying look when they hear I'm single and almost 50, but I don't mind being alone at all. In my early 20s, I did get married, but my husband turned out to be a complete deadbeat, and he cheated on me just a year after our wedding. Why did I marry such a man? If we were going to get divorced so soon, wouldn't it have been better not to get married in the first place? Some people might think that, and I certainly do. Back then, I was in my early 20s, so I can only chalk it up to youthful foolishness. It's truly a dark chapter in my life, but the only silver lining is that we didn't have any children. I have no desire to marry again. However, the only regret I have about being single is that I can't show my child's face to my mother. But showing my mother her grandchild's face is something that can be done by someone other than me. Mom, I'm back. Welcome home. It must have been tiring coming from so far away. Oh yes, on Christmas, it is always so crowded and hectic. Holly, could you make some tea, please? I have a sister named Margaret. Unlike me, she is married and has children. When my nephew was young, she used to bring him to our family home and show him to my mother. I used to look forward to playing with my nephew. However, Margaret only brings my nephew to our family home on Christmas. Her husband works in a restaurant and is busy even on Christmas, so it's always just Margaret and my nephew who visit us. My mother and I would have liked to see my nephew more, but we didn't want to bother my sister, so we kept quiet about it. Even though it's only once a year, we're grateful that they show their faces. However, even that stopped when my nephew entered college. Once you're a college student, you might start feeling reluctant to come all the way to the countryside on Christmas. It's unavoidable, but for the past 20 years or so, we had seen my nephew's face at least once a year, so my mother and I feel disappointed that we haven't seen him for the past 5 or 6 years. Since my nephew stopped coming to our house, it's not like I haven't seen Margaret either. Mom, I've come to visit. How are you doing? Margaret, like a child, kicks off her shoes at the entrance and ignores me as she hurries into the house. I straighten out her shoes and then head back into the house. In contrast to her Christmas visits with my nephew, Margaret now comes back irregularly. Being once a year, without any connection to the holiday, my sister talks to my mother with a smile on her face. Her actions are a picture-perfect example of filial piety. However, when my nephew isn't around, both my mother and I can't help but force a smile. As I enter the living room, Margaret is massaging my mother's shoulders and speaking with a smile. "Mom, I really want something," she says. What is it this time?" My mother responds, "Well, recently, our coffee maker broke down. We can't do without our morning coffee in our household, so now the whole family is grumpy in the mornings. If we continue like this, it could lead to a family breakdown." My mother sighs in exasperation, and I can't help but let out a sigh, too. Margaret, on her own, is in high spirits, and she gazes at my mother with a smile. She often asks my mother for money. When my father was alive, she used to pester him for money as well. The reason my sister used to bring my nephew back on Christmas was not just for the Christmas presents he received from my parents and me, but also an opportunity for her to ask for money and things. However, since my nephew stopped coming home, she no longer insists on adhering to the Christmas timing and started coming irregularly to our house. I'd say there's a 99.9% chance that when she comes home, she'll ask my mother for money. The only time I can recall my sister not asking for money during her visits was when her husband caught a cold on Christmas, and she left my nephew with us, rushing back to her own home. That happened only once. My sister works part-time, and since she's married, she doesn't have much disposable income. I can understand her desire to lean on our parents a bit. However, she has no reservations about asking for money, which can be quite troublesome. This time, she's planning to buy a coffee maker. Well, it would be sufficient to get one for around $200. She wants to purchase an expensive one that costs $600. She's 52 years old now, and constantly asking for money like a child isn't an ideal situation. Sometimes I try to caution her. "Margaret, couldn't you buy the coffee maker by yourself?" And asking for $600. Isn't that a bit extravagant? I ask. "Well, Mom said it's okay, so it's fine. Besides, you wouldn't understand being single and living with our parents. Having a family comes with various financial responsibilities. It's not like you, Holly, who can use your entire salary for yourself." My sister has no shame about asking for money from my mother, and my attempts to caution her don't seem to have any effect. And behind my sister's back, my mother often wears a troubled expression. And gestures with her right hand, as if to say, "Just let it go, don't say anything." If my mother gives her instructions, I have no choice but to back down. It's a routine. My sister was the type who'd throw a tantrum if her demands weren't met when she was a child. If she wanted a certain doll at a toy store and her parents initially refused, she would cry and sit there for tens of minutes, shouting and attracting the attention of other customers until her parents couldn't bear the embarrassment and eventually bought her the doll. Of course, she doesn't throw tantrums like that anymore, but if my mother hesitates about giving her money, my sister will persistently cling to her. Oh, by the way, the coffee maker I'm planning to buy comes with a stainless steel milk frother and cups for cappuccino. It's a good deal to get them together. Could you give me money for that too? How much is that set going to cost? About $200. Do you really need to buy that set to use the coffee maker? At least pay for the set yourself. Even though she had just received $600, she immediately asked for an additional $200, causing my mother to wear a stern expression. Just understanding that she'll be pestered, my mother hastily left the living room for the kitchen, even though she had no reason to be there. My sister stuck to my mother's back closely, saying, "Just $200 more." Ignoring her, my mother began preparing tea, probably not wanting to engage further. I watched their exchange, considering it as the usual routine, and moved a little away from them, observing with a cool detachment. "Don't ignore me," my sister said. "I heard that with those milk containers, you can make delicious cappuccinos and lates." Mom returned with tea, but my sister didn't leave her side. And those cups are designed so that coffee doesn't cool down quickly. My mother appeared uneasy with my sister clinging to her, so she left the steaming tea untouched and headed towards the restroom. My sister followed her, speaking towards the bathroom door. I'm thinking of using those cups for guests since they have a stylish design. You know, we can't serve coffee to guests in tacky cups, can we? Well, I guess you have a point. All right then. When my mother emerged from the bathroom, she succumbed to my sister's persistence, giving her the additional $200. This is why my mother stopped me from cautioning my sister. Exekiel, if I were to caution her and not give her the money, it would only prolong the time my sister pesters my mother. If my sister's requests were denied, she would become very clingy. In this case, with an amount of $200, it was resolved within about 10 minutes. However, about 20 years ago, when my sister demanded a larger amount of money for her education, it was a different story. This pestering lasted for a whole week. During that time, my sister stayed over at our parents' house and relentlessly continued her requests, ignoring time and place, even when our parents were in the bathroom taking a bath, eating, or sleeping. After a week of being persistently pestered, our parents' mental state had deteriorated, and they ultimately gave in to my sister's demands. During that incident, I couldn't help but admire my sister beyond exasperation. The next morning, my sister left humming a tune after receiving the money for the coffee maker. Well, it's not a reason to praise her. My sister does visit our parents' house and ask for money only about once a year. Moreover, despite all the fuss, she doesn't demand unreasonable amounts. Considering how much she relies on our parents, I believe she truly values our mother. Since our mother also approves, I refrain from getting too involved in my sister's actions. 6 months after my sister's visit, it was still too early for her next homecoming, but I had called her to come back. Mom had fallen ill. "Can you come right away?" I asked upon receiving the call. My sister flew over the same day, and I was reassured thinking that she indeed cared for our mother. My sister and I listened to the doctor's explanation, and it was mostly as we had expected. Our mother is turning 80 this year. I don't want to say it out loud, but that's what it amounts to. As our mother needed to be hospitalized, my sister and I decided to return home. When we arrived home and saw the living room empty without our mother, I felt a sense of loneliness. "I can't stay in this house, so Mom will rely on you more, Holly. Is it become more dependable?" My sister tried to encourage me, noticing my somewhat forlorn expression. Her choice of words bothered me a little, but she must be quite shaken as well. My sister's awkward attempt at encouragement made me feel slightly more optimistic. However, the following morning, something happened that made me doubt whether my sister's words of encouragement were truly meant for me. "Sis, what are you doing? The extra plans?" I'm not doing anything special. Just looking for my smartphone. It's gone missing. I have an idea where it might be, so don't worry. When I woke up, my sister was wandering around the house. It seemed like she was checking drawers, closets, and such, but it didn't look like she was searching for her smartphone at all. Even by noon, my sister continued to roam around the house. "Yes, lunch is ready," I called out loudly from inside the house to my sister, who was in the barn in the yard. She was looking at her smartphone screen. My sister's behavior seemed a bit odd, but considering the situation with our mother, I decided not to dwell on it. She left without any incident later that evening. 6 months later, we received a call from the hospital saying that our mother's condition had worsened, so my sister and I headed to the hospital. When we entered the hospital room, our mother was unconscious and couldn't engage in conversation anymore. However, the nurse assured us that she could still hear our voices. So I continued to tell her childhood memories. 3 hours later, our mother passed away. I had been prepared for this for the past 6 months, and knowing that she would now be with our father, I managed to keep my composure despite the overwhelming sadness. However, any lapse in concentration threatened to unleash a flood of tears and drive me to madness. Perhaps sensing my vulnerability, my sister put her arm around my shoulder and led me outside the hospital room. In the hallway, I took a deep breath to regain some composure. My sister was watching my face. I thought she was trying to say something comforting, but the words that came out of her mouth were completely unexpected. "What about Mom's inheritance? That house is the only valuable thing, right? How should we divide it?" My thoughts came to a screeching halt at my sister's completely unexpected words. My mind went blank, unable to think about anything, and even my sorrow faded to white. My mind had stopped working, and I couldn't find words to respond. My sister proceeded to talk. "When Mom fell ill and I checked the house, there was nothing that seemed valuable, you know. Are you going to continue living in that house? If so, I won't have anything left to inherit." Hey, wait a minute, don't spring that on me all of a sudden. People usually discuss these things ahead of time, right? It's been 6 months, so it's not sudden. So, I've been thinking about it. The house is old, and I think it's becoming unsafe for you to keep living there. Even if you renovate, it's a big old house in the countryside, so it would cost a lot of money. So, what if we just demolish the house and sell the land? The land is quite spacious, so it should fetch a good price, and it would be easier to divide that way, don't you think? My mother had just passed away, and not even 20 seconds had passed since we left the hospital room. My sister had started talking about the inheritance distribution as if it were the most natural thing to do. It was inappropriate to have that sort of conversation yet. People have many different emotions, but at that moment, anger surpassed them all. My sister's words added a layer of intense anger on top of my sadness. Can I have everything that's left in the house? Holly, you're single, so you don't really need that much money, right? But it would be too unfair if I took everything. So you can have that old shed in the backyard. I'll give you what's in there. My sister wore a smug expression, blatantly defying my anger. It seems like her plan was to take the bank book and cash for herself while selling the furniture and appliances for some extra cash. The main prize, of course, was the money from selling the land, but she also intended to push the responsibility of cleaning up the rundown backyard shed onto me. We'll split the land evenly, so let's share the cost of demolishing the house. But you can handle the demolition cost of that old shack in the backyard on your own since it's yours, she added with a grin. It seemed my initial hunch was correct. I had a lot of complaints to share with my sister after all. However, rejecting her demands at this point would likely lead to her pestering me relentlessly. Dealing with a substantial asset like the land was sure to become a hassle. Moreover, my mother's situation was the most pressing concern right now. Fine, I understand. Really? Asked Megili. Thanks, connection. Without returning to the hospital room where our mother was, my sister left the area with a spring in her step. I decided to prioritize my mother's situation over my feelings towards my sister and accepted her demands on the spot. It seemed that, for my sister, our mother was nothing more than a piggy bank. My anger grew bigger inside me. However, when my sister was gone, I surprised myself by immediately agreeing to demolish our childhood home and sell the land. Looking back, I think that my hasty decision was, in a way, a push from my parents to scold my sister on their behalf. After my mother's funeral, we decided to discuss the formal inheritance process at my mother's memorial party. In the meantime, I began to tackle the cleanup of the old shed. Later on, my sister, perhaps wanting to avoid the topic of splitting the demolition cost for the shed, brought a handwritten document containing the details of our conversation outside the hospital room and asked me to sign it. I wanted to lose my temper and argue, but at that moment, I was filled with irritation. Recalling that, I started to feel a hint of frustration while cleaning up the ramshackle shed. Given that my sister had handed them off to me, everything in the barn was nothing but dusty and scattered items. The barn itself was in shambles, with walls and pillars in a dilapidated state. I couldn't help but think that one good kick on a pillar could bring the whole thing crashing down. As I started to clean up the shed, I found several items. I hoped they might be valuable, but I couldn't find their market value online. The antique valuations, unlike those for games or branded items, usually required extensive research. Proper appraisal was usually required, making it difficult to research easily online. Even if something appeared expensive, most of it was actually worthless. My sister came to the same conclusion after checking online valuations for the shed's contents. I had no complaints if it meant getting rid of the vases, but there was one major problem. How do I dispose of this? I was already too exhausted to tackle this issue. As I looked at it, all I could do was sigh deeply. There was an old car in the shed that seemed impossible to move. It had been covered with a car cover for a long time, so despite some rust, it looked surprisingly clean, considering it had been abandoned for decades. However, it was not worth the high cost of repairs, and it wasn't something I had any intention of driving. Since this would take some time, I decided to leave it for last. As I continued cleaning up the shed, a dusty safe emerged from the corner. It stood about knee-high and was about the width of one arm. It was a classic black safe, with a dial that one might commonly see on TV or in manga. Of course there was no key, and I couldn't see what was inside. Furthermore, it was too heavy for me to move on my own. As more troublesome items emerged after the car, I once again found myself in a predicament. However, I suddenly remembered watching a TV show where they attempted to open a locked safe. In that program, a locksmith had successfully opened a safe. Well, it turned out to be empty. The safe itself seemed to have value, and the locksmith offered a decent sum to buy it. Although the safe in front of me didn't appear to have any value, I couldn't help but be curious about its contents. So, with a bit of excitement, I contacted a locksmith. The locksmith arrived an hour later, and to my disappointment, the safe was opened quite easily in about 10 minutes. It turned out to be a safe made around 40 years ago, and its mechanism wasn't overly complicated. With no great expectations for its contents, I opened the safe. Inside, I found a single picture. I glanced at it briefly and saw that it featured illustrations of medieval life. Since it was inside the safe, it might be valuable. What do you think? I asked, trying to appear uncertain. In reality, I had already decided to have an antique dealer take a look at it. While I didn't have high hopes for obscure vases and tea utensils, I didn't want to waste the effort if they turned out to be completely worthless. Besides, if I called in an appraiser for trash, I would feel embarrassed. However, since I had found a scroll tucked away in the safe, it was worth having an antique dealer assess it. The next day, I called a dealer who specialized in antique items with a sense of excitement. The next day, the dealer came for a house call due to the quantity of items. It turned out that the picture was the work of a famous artist, though the actual appraisal value was only $1,000. It wasn't the several million or billion dollars you might see on TV, but it was still a respectable sum. Following the picture, other items came from the shed. I kept getting other items appraised one after another. Things that he had thought were worthless were getting price tags of thousands of dollars one after another. After appraising the other items from the shed, the total value of the antiques came to around $3,000. They also agreed to take the items that had no appraisal value. However, they would keep the antiques in their possession for a while, and the formal purchase would take place after the inheritance discussions and paperwork were completed. Nevertheless, clearing out the shed was a breeze after they took away the items, as everything was assessed, and I was about to bid the dealer goodbye with a feeling of satisfaction. They asked me, "Isn't the car covered up over there?" "Yes, it is. It's a beat-up one that I plan to get rid of." What caught the attention of the appraiser was the dilapidated car left in the shed. After removing the cover once, I had been too lazy to put it back on neatly, so it had become quite haphazardly covered. As a result, some parts of the car were visible. Hey, that car might actually be valuable, you know. But that car is in terrible shape, rusted in spots, and practically unusable. Well, I'm just saying, it's probably a popular model among vintage car enthusiasts. I can introduce you to a friend who owns a garage. How about having them take a look? From the locksmith to the appraiser, and from the appraiser to the car dealer, more and more people involved with the barn were connected. Sometimes, things like this were a matter of fate, and perhaps I could save myself the trouble of disposing of the car. With that in mind, I made a call to the recommended car dealer. The next day, the car dealer came to my house. When the car dealer saw the car, their eyes widened for a moment and they began to inspect the inside and the underside of the car. After about 30 minutes, the car dealer told me something shocking. This car is actually a domestically produced model that was popular among enthusiasts about 40 years ago. The condition isn't that bad, and I'd be willing to buy it for $50,000. Bam request, $50,000? I was so surprised that my eyes felt like they were popping out of my head. With this amount, I could cover the demolition costs of both the shed and the house. I felt grateful for the connections I had made with the locksmith and the car dealer. However, the tailwind for me wasn't over yet. I hope this isn't rude, but is it okay to sell this car? Did it belong to your father? Well, it did belong to my father, but he's not here anymore, so it's fine. Actually, my mother passed away recently too, and I'm in the process of cleaning up the house. However, with the car valued at $50,000, my sister might have some objections. In that case, it might be a good idea to consult with a lawyer. A lawyer, huh? About 2 weeks later, after my mother's memorial party, my sister and I decided to have a discussion about the inheritance. As for the distribution of the inheritance, it's fine the way we discussed before, right? So, shall we decide on a schedule for disposing of the belongings and demolishing the house? Sis, can I confirm one thing before that? Reed, the shed is going to be mine, right? That's right. Why are you bringing this up now? We even signed the paperwork on the day of the funeral. You know you have to cover the demolition costs for the shed, right? I'm not questioning that. I just wanted to make sure. You see, the antiques from the shed were worth $3,000, and the car is worth $50,000. What did you say? My sister was so astonished that her jaw looked like it might unhinge. I could understand her feelings because I felt like my eyeballs were about to pop out too. No one could have imagined that a treasure was hidden in that rundown old barn. I've been thinking maybe we should divide the barn equally after all? It wouldn't be fair otherwise, right? Upon learning that what came out of the barn, I had reluctantly taken responsibility for amounted to $53,000. My sister quickly changed her tune. I, who had been handed the barn, was not going to agree to her proposal. You mean to break the promise you made with me in writing? Although my sister was usually quite stubborn and wouldn't budge until her demands were met, this time she had already gotten her way. Therefore, she couldn't argue about the barn, and she reluctantly conceded to my logical argument. It's okay, really. It's just $53,000. There was about $20,000 in my mother's savings. Besides, I'd be satisfied with getting half of the money from selling this house's land. When I checked, this house's land is roughly 1,000 square yards, and the market price is about $20,000. Since we'll split the demolition costs in half, I should end up with about $60,080 to ends to rough. That should be more than enough. In dramas and movies, you often see scenes where people fight over inheritances worth tens of millions of dollars or large houses. However, in reality, it's often on this scale. It's still a significant amount, considering it exceeds $200,000. Nonetheless, as I watched my sister, who was desperately haggling over $80,000, I couldn't help but feel a sense of emptiness. I wondered how our parents would feel if they saw our current conversation. Perhaps they knew that my sister would end up in this situation and secretly guided me to make various decisions and establish connections with different people. Thinking about this, I felt that I needed to put our parents' minds at ease. Unfortunately, sis, that $60,000 you're planning to take will go to me instead. Wait, what are you talking about? Dennis, about 20 years ago. Didn't you say you wanted to build a house because you were having a child and you got a down payment from mom and dad? Oh yeah, I remember that. It took me a week of pestering, but they finally gave me the money back then. I really worked hard for it. The money you received back then was $60,000, right? Apparently, that falls under special benefit. Wait, what does that mean? My sister, who already had an inkling of what was going on, couldn't meet my eyes and looked away. I decided to consult with the lawyer recommended by the car dealer. The story that came up was about special benefit. There were various conditions, but in essence, if you had received money or property like land in advance, it would be subtracted from the inheritance before dividing the estate. It was a matter of fairness. So, my sister received a whopping $60,000 as funds for buying the house from our parents, but I didn't get any. Therefore, when it comes to dividing the inheritance, it's unfair if I don't get an extra $60,000. Like, come on, and expect you? If I give you $60,000, I'll be left with nothing. Don't forget you have $53,000 from the barn, right? Can't that count as my share? I just checked earlier, just whether I can have the barn stuff or not. So, the barn is a completely separate matter. What we're dividing here is the land, isn't it? Well then, I won't get any money. Moreover, I'll have to pay at least $20,000 for the demolition of the house, even if we split it. I think you'll have to pay more than $20,000. For P-clips, impossible. I won't pay $20,000 when I won't get anything in return. Well, there's a better solution. You can take nothing, and I'll take everything, the house and the land. That's not fair at all. If Holly is getting the house and the land, you should give me something too. Are you saying that, even though you pushed the decrepit old barn onto me? Let me make it clear that I have no intention of yielding on this condition. Now choose. Either back down without getting anything, or pay me $20,000 to demolish this house. House? Naturally, my sister had no choice but to back down. She wore a frustrated expression as she left the house, and so I successfully protected the house without giving anything to my sister. After this incident, it's unlikely that she will come to the house for a while. Therefore, I won't have to deal with her persistently asking me for something again. I clasped my hands in front of the family altar, reporting to my parents in the afterlife that I managed not to give anything to my sister and thanking them for orchestrating this turn of events. A few days later, I received a phone call from my sister's husband, who apologized to me. It turned out that my sister had hidden both her requests for money from our mother and this inheritance matter from the family. Additionally, the reason my nephew had stopped coming around when he became a college student was not because he didn't want to visit his family. When he became a college student, we stopped giving him Christmas presents. Therefore, my sister used the promise of Christmas presents as leverage to ask our mother for money. She thought there was no point in bringing him along on Christmas anymore, as he wouldn't be receiving anything. My nephew apparently learned about this situation for the first time during our recent discussions about the inheritance. Furthermore, regarding the inheritance matter, she had been recklessly spending money, thinking she would receive around $60,000. It was irrational behavior to assume that she could spend that money before actually receiving it. Although she didn't spend the full $60,000, my sister had used up more than $20,000 of the family's money in the past month. Both my nephew and her husband gave her a stern talking to when they found out that she had used my nephew as a pawn to ask our mother for money and had depleted $20,000 of the family's money. Now, she's become quite humble, reflecting on her actions. I believe this outcome is the result of our parents coming from the afterlife to give my sister an advantage. With no need to demolish the house anymore, I still live in my childhood home. I converted the treasure from the barn into cash and set it aside for future house repairs. Additionally, my nephew, now a working adult, occasionally comes to visit. Today, I'm thankful for the peaceful days I get to enjoy without any trouble and offer my prayers in front of the family altar.